You are lying in bed and your eyes are heavy, but your brain feels like it is plugged into a wall socket. You want to sleep more than anything in the world, but the silence of your room is being killed by a tiny sound. It is a low, thrumming noise that feels like it is coming from the very bones of the building. Imagine 10 million people all trying to close their eyes at the exact same time and realizing that sleep has been deleted. This is the story of Neo-Veridia and the night that the lights stayed on for a reason that will haunt your nightmares. Elias Vance sat in a dark room filled with glowing screens and the smell of stale coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He used to be a famous researcher who studied why humans need to dream, but a scandal had ruined his life. Now he was just a voice on the other end of an emergency line, taking calls from people who were having the worst night of their lives. At 11 o'clock, the phones usually started to quiet down as the city went to bed, but tonight was different. Every single light on his console was blinking red, and the noise of the ringing was starting to give him a headache. The first caller was a man named Arthur who sounded like he was about to cry because he couldn't stop shaking. Arthur said he had taken 3 different types of sleeping pills, but his heart was racing like he had just run a marathon. Then a woman named Clara called from the other side of the city and said she could feel her floorboards vibrating. She told Elias that her cat was standing in the middle of the kitchen staring at the ceiling and hissing at nothing. Elias tried to tell them to stay calm, but deep down, he felt a cold shiver running down his own spine. He looked at the big map on the wall that showed where all the emergency calls were coming from in the city. The calls weren't random at all because they were all clustered around the shiny new towers that had just been built. These were the 6G smart grid towers that were supposed to make the city the fastest and most connected place on Earth. Social media was already exploding with thousands of posts from people who were confused and starting to get very angry. People were posting videos of themselves staring into mirrors with bloodshot eyes and asking if anyone else was still awake. The jokes and the memes about insomnia lasted for about an hour before the true panic started to set in. Elias watched a live stream of the main highway where a massive car pileup had just turned the road into a graveyard of metal. A driver had suffered what doctors call a waking seizure, where his brain just shut off while his eyes stayed wide open. He had plowed into a line of cars at 80 miles per hour because his mind couldn't tell the difference between reality and a dream. Elias realized that the rhythm of the calls was matching the frequency of the towers, and he knew this wasn't an accident. At 1 in the morning, the mayor of the city walked onto a stage to give a live speech to the terrified citizens. The mayor was wearing a suit that was wrinkled, and his eyes were so red they looked like they were bleeding. He told everyone that there was a minor technical glitch and that they should just go back to their beds and wait. But as he spoke, his left eye started to twitch uncontrollably, and he kept licking his lips like he couldn't get enough water. It was obvious to everyone watching that the leader of the city hadn't slept either, and he was losing his mind on live TV. Suddenly, the door to the dispatch center burst open, and a woman with messy hair and a heavy backpack ran inside. Her name was Sarah, and she was a rogue engineer who had helped build the very towers that were killing the city's rest. She looked at Elias and told him that she had the kill code to stop the signal, but she needed his help to use it. She said the signal was a loop that was forcing the brain to stay in a state of high energy that would eventually burn it out. As they talked, reports started coming in about the wide-eyed effect, which was a terrifying change in the people outside. People's pupils were dilating until their eyes looked like solid black marbles, and they were starting to act like wild animals. They weren't just tired anymore, because their brains were starving for rest, and they were becoming incredibly aggressive. The military moved in and sealed all the exits to the city with heavy trucks and barbed wire fences. They claimed there was a biological leak, but Elias knew they were just trying to keep the madness from spreading outside. By 3 in the morning, the city reached what Elias called the hallucination threshold, where the walls between worlds began to crumble. When you go long enough without sleep, your brain starts to dream while you are still awake, and that is when things get scary. People started reporting that they were seeing the gray men, which were dark shapes that flickered in the corners of their vision. The gray men didn't have faces, and they seemed to glide through walls as they watched the citizens suffer in the dark. Widespread paranoia took over as neighbors started accusing each other of being the ones who were making the noise. Elias and Sarah had to run for their lives because a mob of wide-eyed people broke into the dispatch center. The mob believed that Elias was hiding the cure in his desk, and they were tearing everything apart with their bare hands. As they escaped into the cold night air, Elias received a private message on his phone from a man he thought was dead. It was Dr. Eris Thorne, his old mentor, who had disappeared years ago after suggesting that sleep was a waste of human potential. Thorne told Elias that the city was now part of a forced evolution experiment to see what humans could do if they never stopped. He said that a society that never sleeps is a society that never stops working and never stops buying things. Elias felt sick to his stomach as he realized that millions of people were being used like batteries in a giant machine. They passed a park where a group of people had formed something called the Lullaby Cult and were chanting to the towers. They were kneeling in the grass and banging their heads against the ground in time with the thrumming sound. They believed the sound was the voice of a new god, and they were waiting for it to tell them what to do next. The city's power grid started to flicker and die because the people who ran the power plants were too delirious to work. Water systems failed and the streets began to smell like trash and fear as the basic parts of life just stopped working. Sarah explained that the signal was vibrating the very air around them, which was why the temperature in the city was rising. It felt like they were walking inside a giant microwave that was slowly cooking their brains while they were still alive. They decided they had to get to the hospital to find some medicine that would help them stay focused for the final push. But the hospital had turned into a house of horrors because the doctors and nurses had completely lost their grip on reality. Elias saw a surgeon trying to operate on a man with a plastic fork because he thought he was at a dinner party. The hallways were filled with people screaming for sleep, but there was no rest to be found in the entire city. Elias felt a sharp pain in his chest when he remembered that his teenage daughter Maya was staying in the center of the city. She was in the red zone, which was the area where the signal was the strongest and the danger was the highest. He tried to call her, but the phone lines were jammed with the screams of 10 million people who couldn't close their eyes. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the city reached its peak, and the air was humming so loudly that it made their ears bleed. The screaming had mostly stopped by now, and a creepy silence had fallen over the streets of Neo-Veridia. Millions of people were standing perfectly still on the sidewalks and in their yards, just staring up at the dark sky. Their eyes were wide and black, and they looked like statues that had been placed there by some cruel artist. Elias and Sarah knew they had to reach the Aegis Tower, which was the tallest building in the heart of the grid. The tower was a needle of glass and steel that glowed with a sickly blue light against the morning clouds. As they got closer, Sarah stopped and looked at Elias with tears in her eyes and a shaking hand on her laptop. She confessed that she was part of the original team that designed the frequency to control how people felt. She needed Elias's special clearance codes to reverse the signal, and he didn't even know he had them in his mind. Thorne had hidden the codes in Elias's memories years ago during a medical trial that Elias had forgotten about. They had to sneak past the wide-eyed guards who were standing at the entrance of the tower like frozen soldiers. These guards had been given special chemicals to keep them from going crazy, so they were still sharp and dangerous. Elias used a heavy fire extinguisher to knock out a guard who tried to grab Sarah as they ran for the elevator. The elevator wouldn't work because the power was too low, so they had to climb 60 flights of stairs in the dark. Each step felt like their legs were made of lead, and their brains were begging them to just lay down and die. But they knew that if they closed their eyes now, they would never wake up again because the signal would fry their nerves. When they finally reached the penthouse at the top, they found Dr. Thorne sitting in a chair looking out at the city. He looked perfectly rested and calm, which made Elias want to scream with rage at the unfairness of it all. Thorne told them that the experiment was a success and that the human race was ready to move past the need for rest. He said that sleep was just a bug in our biological software, and he had finally found the patch to fix it. Elias looked out the window and saw his daughter Maya standing in the street below among the thousands of silent people. He realized that the signal wasn't just coming from the towers anymore, because it was being bounced between the people. The collective fear and the high-energy brain waves of the citizens were actually powering the frequency loop. The city was keeping itself awake, and the only way to stop it was to break the connection with a massive shock. Sarah hooked her laptop into the main transmitter and told Elias that someone had to stay connected to the machine. The person who stayed would have to absorb a lethal dose of the frequency to act as a ground for the electrical surge. Elias didn't hesitate for a single second because he knew he was the only one who could make it work with his codes. He sat in the chair and let Sarah wrap the wires around his arms while the computer started to beep a warning. The sun began to rise over the horizon, but it was a sun that no one in the city had slept to see. The light was pale and cold, and it made the wide-eyed citizens look like ghosts standing in the morning mist. Elias felt the first wave of energy hit his body, and it felt like his blood was being turned into boiling oil. He saw images of his life flashing before his eyes like a movie being played at 1,000 times the normal speed. He saw Maya as a little girl, and he saw the faces of all the people he couldn't help when he was a researcher. He pushed the final button on the console, and the Aegis Tower began to shake like it was being hit by an earthquake. A deafening pop sound echoed across the entire valley, and the blue light of the towers turned into a blinding white. Every single light in Neo-Veridia went out at the exact same time, and the hum finally disappeared into the air. For a heartbeat, there was a silence so deep that it felt like the world had stopped spinning on its axis. Then 10 million people simultaneously collapsed onto the ground like puppets whose strings had been cut. They fell where they stood on the sidewalks, and in the middle of the roads, and in their own hallways. They didn't die, but they fell into a deep and heavy coma that their bodies desperately needed to survive. Sarah looked at Elias and saw that he was still breathing, but his hair had turned white from the stress of the shock. He was the only person left awake in a city of 10 million sleeping souls, and he watched the sun climb higher. The cars were still sitting in the roads with their engines off, and the birds were starting to chirp in the trees. It was the first quiet morning in the history of the city, and there was no one left to hear it but him. He walked out of the tower and down the stairs, feeling the cool air on his face for the first time in forever. He found Maya lying on the pavement near a fountain, and he sat down beside her to wait for her to wake up. He knew it might take days or even weeks for the people to come back from the darkness of that night. But the thrumming was gone, and the gray men had vanished back into the shadows where they belonged. The experiment was over, and the city had survived the night, but the world would never be the same again. People would always remember the feeling of the floor vibrating and the sight of their neighbors' black eyes. They would never look at a cell phone tower or a smart device the same way because they knew the truth now. The truth is that our dreams are the only thing that keeps us human, and without them we are just machines. Elias closed his eyes and felt the weight of 1,000 years of tiredness finally pulling him down into the dark. He wasn't afraid anymore because he knew that when he opened his eyes the nightmare would finally be finished. He drifted off to the sound of his own breathing and the gentle warmth of the morning sun on his tired skin. The city was silent and the world was safe for now, but the towers were still standing there waiting for the next flip of a switch. If you want to see what happens when the rest of the world finds out what happened in Neo-Veridia, watch this next video.